So welcome to Advanced Motion Design. Today we're going to be reviewing a little bit of After Effects. I don't know when the last time some people used it, more than likely motion design, and probably compositing and special effects for visual communication students. With any software, you definitely, if you don't use it, you lose it, and After Effects is one of those programs that you definitely want to stay in touch with and practice often, because there's a lot of moving parts, literally, and a lot of shortcuts, which I'm always going to talk about in this class, but it's really hard to recall those if you're not using them. So today we're going to be talking about creating faux 3D in After Effects, meaning that these layers are 3D and that they exist in XYZ space, but they're not extruded. They're not spheres. They don't actually have depth to them. They're just flat objects, and they're actually not even, the planets themselves aren't being animated. They're all parented to a null object, and that null is just moving forward in 3D space. So if I was to look at two views here and scrub back and forth, you can see the null is actually driving all these individual things, which are the planets that are kind of spread out along the Z. So this is a top-down view. And I'll be rebuilding this in just an example. But when you look at that top-down view, we have a light right here, if I turn that on and off. Not a huge difference, but it adds some nice consistent darkness to all the 3D layers. Those are the only layers that are going to pick up the lighting. And that's really one of the main things about lighting in After Effects, is lighting is really only used for 3D objects, whether they're faux 3D or true, because they are only going to appear on 3D objects. And I'll, like I said, come back to that in a moment. But I have my light, which isn't doing too much. I have my null that everything is parented to. So you can see most things are parented to null 1, except for the little fire. The fire is parented to the rocket so that it goes around with it. So pretty basic. There's just a star background. There's a little fade in from this black solid in the beginning. If I select all and click U to show keyframes, you can see that despite a lot of movement in this piece, there's actually very few keyframes. And that's because most of them, the null really only has 2, just at the beginning and end. The black solid fades in, and then the rocket really has the most animation going on here. So for having very few keyframes, it's a pretty engrossing scene because it draws us forward into it. And even if this was purely 2D and didn't have a Z dimension, we could simulate something like this with scale, but you don't get the sense of parallax that we do here. And parallax is something we'll come back to throughout the semester. It's something you really only see when there's depth in your objects. When you're seeing something, it's like when you're driving and the stoplights and telephone poles are moving at a different speed than the distant background. So everything's moving the same speed, but parallax gives you a different sense of it while you're viewing it. And so if we wanted to recreate something like this, before then, oh, you could see the rocket path right here. The rocket path actually moves away from what we're seeing. It should be getting a little smaller there. It does, but it's hard to perceive. Anyways, what we're going to be focusing on is just creating that 2.5D. And before we go into outer space, we need to talk about basic 3D space. And so I mentioned 3D layers are the only ones that can get that Z dimension. If I click P for position, you've got X, Y, and Z. We get that attribute by making a layer 3D, by clicking on this little cube icon. And by making it 3D, we get that Z option. If I turn that on and off, you can see it just becomes flat and the lighting doesn't affect it anymore. But when it's 3D, it can have that Z dimension, it can rotate back in that space, and then also the light affects it. In an upcoming class, we're going to be talking about true 3D, by the way. So this is totally flat, as you can see. Eventually, we'll be moving on to extruding in Photoshop and Illustrator, and even using a little bit of Cinema 4D. You can see this is essentially the same text, but the top-down view, you can see it's extruded along the Z, not just angled within it. So we'll definitely come back to that. We're also going to rebuild our little rocket using Faux 3D in Illustrator. You can see this actually has like shading and lighting, whereas this other one was just some clip art I grabbed, which I normally don't do, but I did it for comparison's sake. And then I'll talk about the next class at the end. But for now, let me create a new composition. Let's just call this 3D Review. And I'm going to add just some text. Let me grab my text tool here. And it's giving me the 2 view here, which is interesting. It really shouldn't do that unless I already have a 3D layer. And it's because I'm working with 3D objects, but if I type in 3D and not in that font, though I promise you I won't spend forever picking one. I said that, but then I chose one that didn't have the character for 3. Let's go with this very authentic looking kind of faux Asian font, maybe not orange. So if I wanted to make this a 3D layer, all I need to do is go next to the layer within the layer palette, and we have these different switches and modes. Like we can make a layer shy, we can change the quality of it, we can add a motion blur, an adjustment layer, and this very last option right before the parent column is this little cube. So you can see from the tooltip, this makes the layer 3D, which just makes it available to be modified in 3 dimensions. So if we were to look at the properties for this and just twirl down transform, you could see that anything with X and Y has just those 2. And then rotation also has just number of revolutions and degrees. If we click on that little cube column next to the layer, you can see we get quite a few more options. Most notably, we get Z, this last number. And without light or cameras, it really just looks like scale, unless you're looking at a top-down view and can see it's moving in that space. By the way, the composition itself is always just a rectangle, regardless of whether you're looking at it from the top, side, bottom, etc. So that's not really how this square looks, but a rectangle rather. That's just how After Effects draws it. Let's zoom in on that. So when the layer is 3D, you can see you get lots of different options. In fact, in this top-down view, there is no top-down because it doesn't exist. And when a layer is 3D, when you have any 3D layer, you'll get these additional options under your stage area that should have already been set to 1 view, which is the default. But when something's 3D, you can choose the amount of views there is to be able to compare different angles and movement. So 2 views is really helpful when working with 3D. So I already mentioned Z, which just looks like scale without any other factors. You also have anchor point with Z, though I have to say I don't normally change that. Anchor point's just where something changes from. So if I wanted to rotate the text, I would have to change where the anchor point is, which I can do with just the pan behind tool. Position, like I said, basically scale. Rotation, you have X, Y, and Z, so you can rotate it along that space as well. It actually separates those features automatically, so you can get some cool angles here that you'd have to use like a perspective effect otherwise on. And then you have opacity, there's no difference there. But then you also get these 2 new options, geometry and material. So geometry is only going to happen if it's actually extruded. And then material is something we'll get to later, but most importantly here is whether or not it casts shadows. By default it does not, but that's because shadows add a lot of rendering time, just like motion blurs do. And then we'll get into this more in the next class when we talk about staging a scene in 3D. But just know it's important to be able to turn these on and off, especially for rendering's sake. Sometimes you might want to RAM preview something without shadows on because it can take so much time. Let me reset these, and I'm going to collapse material options for now. I'm going to bring this object forward, which looks like down since we're in a top-down view. If I went to something like left, you can see how you move it that way. This is mostly helpful when you have lots of layers. So you can see the top down here, but if I do left, you get the same kind of idea of that space moving. Also, these assets are available in the week 2 folder, and I couldn't help myself but call this GIF not a moon, because it's not a moon. And I am a nerd. So in our basic example here, I can rotate this along the Y, or the vertical axes, if I want to kind of tilt it back in space. And let's just switch back to one view right now. When you have more than one view, the one that's active is the whatever has these little blue corners in it. So I'm just going to go back to one view for now. And this just really looks like it's angled, not that it's tilted back into space. We can't perceive depth without light. And in order to have light, we need to have depth. So it's this kind of symbiotic relationship. We can add a light to this, but we're not going to see shadow until there's something to catch that shadow. So like with the space example, there's not a background catching the shadow, but we wouldn't see that in space. I mentioned before there's a light, but that's just to get some consistency with the lighting across all of the 3D objects. Where if they were all 2D objects, I could have used an adjustment layer. Though I could use that for 3D as well, and even animate it if I wanted to. So I'm going to increase the scale of this just a little bit. And I'm going to go up to Layer, New. And within Layer New, we have all of our different helpful objects we can add. I'm going to go to my Light option. Later we'll be adding cameras and null objects as well. And there's adjustment layers, which I just mentioned. And eventually, Cinema 4D, which is also within this Layer New dropdown. So I'm going to add a light. And whenever you add a light, it's going to give you your light settings. So you can give it a name. You can choose the type of light. For now, I'm just going to work with spot, which gives us kind of a direction and a feather around the light. Basically, think of it as like a stage light. And I can also choose the intensity of that light. I probably don't want 269. Cone angle, feather. Some of these things are hard to visualize if you haven't worked with lighting before, so I'd recommend adding it and then editing it, which is very easy to do. Cast shadows you can have checked on, but like I said, this doesn't matter if there's not something to accept shadows. And then you can affect what that darkness of the shadows looks like or how feathered it is. And it even says here, there's a helpful note, they're only cast from layers set to cast shadows, and they're only visible on layers behind that with accept shadows enabled. So it can be a little confusing, but that's why I mentioned you just need to practice and keep exploring your different options. So I'm going to click OK, and you can see that lighting is quite intense. It's probably the proximity of the object. So let's go back to 2 views here. And let's go to a top-down view, which is normally what I work in. So you can see the light is pointing at this thing, which is kind of at the severe angle. So we're getting the brightest spot on this lower right-hand corner of the D, if that counts as a corner. So I'm going to click on my light. And your light by nature is a 3D object, if I twirl down those options. And notice there's transform and light options. So transform, you've got your point of interest, which is kind of the anchor point. It's what the light is pointed at. So you can see as I scrub that, you get some movement across the 3D text. I can change the position, of course, so I can make it closer or further away from the object, so it's kind of a cool way of revealing something. I can change the orientation of the light, which is basically rotation. Then I could change it along the XYZ axes with these 3 separate rotation options. I want to twirl down my light options, and there I can change things like intensity, color, all of those same options I saw when I created the light, though I can also get to those by just going to Layer, Light Settings. So you've got a few ways of coming back to these options. you're going to have more control with these light option drop downs here. I'm going to increase the intensity here, which you can definitely see. We get results from right away. I can change the color. White's not going to be best since it's a white object. If we make it like a light blue, that's interesting, other than we've got our shadow color, which is obviously black. My cone angle is how wide the spotlight is, and of course all of these things are animatable. Anything with that stopwatch next to it is. So you could do a cool reveal of an object by maybe this is how it ends up. I tend to animate backwards, where I'm bringing in lots of different layers and how I want them to look. Totally not necessary here, but if I want to think about this is how I want it to end up, but then the intro will just be totally closed in. And I love this visual for the cone feather. Of course you can see the results, but just having the cone itself be visible is really handy. So if I close that all the way, and then we play that back, you can just see it kind of open up on the text, which is a nice effect. And then when we're looking at that cone, let's get it like halfway through, we can change the feather of it, so we can make it a really sharp edge, kind of a graphical edge, or really soft. So it really just depends on the style you're looking for. That looks cool too. You can choose the fall off, which is when you're working with multiple objects, the radius of it, the fall off distance, that both has to do with the fall off options. And then we'll come back to fall off, but then cast shadows is definitely something you'll be having to find multiple times. So those two options that the light told us about when we added it was making sure that you have something set to cast shadows and then the other object set to catch shadows. So if I go to cast shadows, this is already set to on, but we're not going to see that unless the thing's behind it. So it's like somebody standing against a wall versus just open air. You could see their shadow against the wall where you couldn't against the sky or horizon. So the composition background itself isn't really there if I turn the transparency grid back on. So I'm going to add a solid. I could also add a background or a video, whatever you could import as a layer. Let's add a solid here. And I'll do a similar color. Let's do more of a green. And I'm going to make it the comp size. Basically, I'm going to keep these default settings. Let's just call this background. And layer order-wise, it's currently on top, so we want to drag that underneath everything else. It's helpful if other things are collapsed so we can see that. So we have our text on top of this. It has the light affecting it. However, this background is totally immune because it's not a 3D object. So with background selected, I'm going to click in that little cube column. And then right away you can see that it is affected by the light. So it's accepting lights, but it's not accepting shadows since it increases in brightness the same way. And this is interesting because of the position of the text and the background's actually intersecting the text, which is why you're only seeing this little bitty corner of it. So if I click on the background and then push that back, we can actually make it into a background and then click S to scale that up. Or I could change the angle of the text or whatever works best for what I'm trying to accomplish. So if I change the angle there, you could see it kind of hides or shows against that. We can make this really pronounced by having the background accept shadows. So because it's 3D, if we twirl those options back down, we'll have material options here. I'm going to twirl those down. After Effects, your vertical space is as prescient as the horizontal space. I can't think of another program quite like that. But as you start to twirl these options down, it definitely can get kind of intense in your timeline down here. If I twirl down my background settings and I have my subject settings down as well, with the 3D text here, if I look at the material options, I can see that my subject is set to cast shadows off, and my material options is also set to that. I don't need the background to have it because that's my wall, but I do want my object to have it. And this isn't on by default, like I said, just because it takes a lot of RAM preview time. But if I turn that on, it really doesn't do too much, just because if this isn't set to accept shadows, oh, which it is, it's just really faint. So if I turn that on and off, you can see it alter with that. And it's actually three things. It's on, off, and only. So when I click that, the green goes away and you're just seeing the shadow there, which is also pretty cool. So accept shadows, we can do on, off, or only. I just want to do on. And you can see if I change the position of the proximity of any of these things, if I change where my light is, if I change where my background is, let me zoom out a little bit here. So if I choose the layer for the background and change that, that could be another cool reveal of an object. Then I could also do things like change my shadow intensity. This is kind of this very much like the light source. If I go to the object casting the shadow, I can choose what the light transmission is, the shininess of the object. So when we get more into materials, we can make this more reflective. And the intensity of that. Metal really doesn't do anything cool. Don't be too excited about that, though we will add metal textures later on. That's really just another way of saying the shininess here. And then, just like that, I can also choose the settings with the background. So you have the light settings, you have the subject settings, and then you have the background settings. So there is a lot of customization here. And I still have that spotlight animation. And I'm trying to RAM preview right now, but you can see it's actually not really even doing anything because it's taking up that much more time. And when that happens, something I recommend is setting your resolution down to a lower amount. This has nothing to do with how it's going to render. This is just for the RAM preview. So if I do like half quality, it also helps to kind of bring in your work area so you're not RAM previewing the whole timeline. So now if I click my space bar, we can actually get an idea of what that looks like and see the speed and things like that. Of course, before this bar is filled in with green, it's not real time. That's the RAM previewing, kind of caching it. And then when you have this work area pulled in, it will just loop what's within there. So it really gives you an idea of how the object looks. So if I move my text and not just my light animation-wise, I'm going to select all and just collapse everything. If I go to my object, I'm going to click R for rotation. So the shortcuts here that I really like to use, since there is very limited vertical space, is the parts of animation. P for position, A for anchor point, R for rotation, T for opacity, and S for scale. If you click those, it just brings up that property versus having to twirl down all of the transform options, which take up even more space when the layer is 3D. It has more than that original 5. And if you want more than one thing, you could just throw a shift in there. So I want position and rotation. So I'm going to click P for position and then Shift R to bring rotation up, which is usually a lot smaller. If this isn't a 3D layer, you can see rotation is just those number of degrees and revolutions. So let me undo to get back to our very impressive angle here. So I want to rotate this to just be flat. So let's have it start this way with Y rotation. Y rotation seems bread related. And then as it gets to the end here, let's have it rotate to just be flat or at 0%. And then if we watch that, we can see the light's moving, but then the object's moving too, which is going to change how the shadow looks. And it looks a little pixelated, but that's just because we're down to half resolution. And if you were looking for something more drop shadowy, like in a traditional graphic design sense, you would just have to bring your background at a closer proximity. So the closer it is to the subject, the tighter the shadow is going to be to it. And you have to be a little careful though, because if it rotates, it might rotate into it. So we have to make sure we're back far enough to accommodate that. But by the time it twirls in, we could have that animate though too. Maybe the background starts here. So if we go P for position on the background, let's have it pull forward at the end just so we get a tighter shadow. Of course we can animate the light or the light settings as well. I just want to play with the depth looking down at an object with the other pieces in the scene. So if we watch that now, the light's moving, the background's moving, and the subject is moving, all of which are affecting the shadow. So at the end here, as the background pulls forward, we should see a slightly tighter drop shadow. Now that we've reviewed the basics of just this 2.5 3D, our Faux 3D in After Effects, let's talk about the exercise files I have in the Week 2 folder. So this is all using the same principles, except we're not using any kind of drop shadow for this since there's not a shadow to be caught. So I'm just going to make a new composition, and I'm going to call this Space 2. In this scene, I'm going to go to my assets, which I created a little subfolder for, and I could just click and drag them right into here. Oh, I forgot Napoleon Dynamite was part of this asset group. I think he's more for the next class, but now I'm going to have to use him in this one too, especially because he's a GIF, which you could also make into a 3D layer. Let's hide him for now. And actually just talking about other toggle switches up here, trying to preserve that space. If you have a layer that you want in the scene but you don't need to see it on the screen, of course you have the eyeball to hide it or show it on the stage, but if you want to show it or hide it in the layer palette here, that's what this little silly icon is for. This is shine a layer. This little guy's named Kilroy. It's like probably one of the weirdest icons I've ever seen in a program. But you got this little guy peeking over a wall with his nose sticking down. If you shy a layer, it kind of tucks behind that wall. It doesn't do anything until you click on this master switch up here. And that will shy any layer marked with that. So it's just a way of preserving the space here. And it will still, if it's visible and shy, you would still see it on the stage. You just wouldn't see it in the layer palette. So it really is just whatever works best for your project. We've got a few different objects that are going to require different types of treatment here. We've got a rocket ship, which I'm actually going to also just turn off for now, especially because that's just clip art. So let's shy that as well. Once the shy toggle is clicked, by just clicking that initial one, it will just hide too. And also Mars wrap, I'm going to hide for now. Obviously this isn't planetary shaped, but in the next class we're going to be talking about, I mentioned Cinema 4D and creating Faux 3D in Illustrator. This is actually using that Mars wrap, and it's still not using a full 3D program. This is just wrapping it around a sphere in After Effects, which we'll come back to in the next class. But it definitely gives you a more perception of being a 3D shape, though it's not a 3D layer at all. I'm going to hide this Mars wrap for now. We'll come back to that. And so I have 3 different planets and this rocket ship, which I want to hide. All right, so these are my 4 assets I want to work with, and they're all a little bit different. We have an illustrated little rocket here. Let's hide that for now, actually. Actually, I'm just going to bring that in again later. You can just delete something until you're ready for it too. It doesn't have to be shied and hidden and everything. So the ping, we obviously need to remove the white from it. Usually when I find a ping, the purpose of that is to have a clear background like this. I find when you look up a ping sometimes, if you ever see the transparency grid in the image preview, it's not really a ping. That transparency grid will be part of the image, which is really lame. So you want to make sure you find a ping that actually has transparency. If it doesn't, you could of course take this into Photoshop and clean it up. But there are some tools that we can use within After Effects as well. And just for now, I'm going to do something kind of weird here. I'm going to make this layer 3D only so that I can go to 2 views and change it back to 1 in the meantime. And then let's make that no longer 3D. I've never had to do that before, but for whatever reason that works, so we'll just stick with that. And so for this, I'm going to use 2 different techniques. In compositing, we talk about keying, which is removing a background. It's usually in a green or blue screen situation. For white, we don't want to key this out because there's white in the map. So if we try to key this, it would actually remove parts of the map as well. Let me just turn this back on so we can see it a little better. And actually, we're going to want a black background for this. So I'm just going to go Layer, New Solid. And let's create a black background. And move that to the back. All right, so it'll be very clear when we remove the white now. So in compositing, what I would do is go to Effect, Keying, and use Key Light. And you'd use screen color to select the green or blue, and it would remove that. However, it doesn't really work so well with white. You can try to remove the white object or the white from it, but it doesn't really do anything. If I click on the blue, that's what Key Light does, is removes green or blue from an image, and then you can kind of adjust that. So we don't want Key Light. Fortunately, there is a keying effect specifically for white or black backgrounds. So if I go to Effect, Keying, I can choose Extract. And with Extract, it's almost like levels in Photoshop, but I can clip the black or white point. So black, you could see we're actually removing the shadows, so that looks kind of cool. Again, anything with the stopwatch next to it can be animated. But the white, if we bring that in a little, we can remove the white background, but we can definitely see when we go too far, because we start eating into the country here. So let's not go that far. And we can get the white to go away. It's a little touchy. However, then we have this white edge around everything, which we definitely don't want to have. And then if I want to remove that little line around it, that border, another thing that we do within keying is just a matte choker, which is probably one of the worst commands names ever, but don't worry, it's M-A-T-T-E, just meaning a background. So right below keying, if you go Effect, Keying, Matte Choker, we can get rid of that extra white, but then we can adjust the softness of it and affect our image a little bit better. But if we turn the Extract on and off in the Matte Choker, you can see how it started. So, long story short, I would probably normally do that in Photoshop, but since we're talking about After Effects and different problem solving, you can do this as well. So now Earth is set. We don't need to do anything with the Death Star GIF, and then Saturn was already a nice cleaned up ping, so we have that as well. So I want to make these 3 layers 3D so I can spread them out in space, literally. Right now they all kind of look a very similar size, and I could go S for scale and change that, and that kind of works, but to move through the scene we really need them to be spaced out. That pun was not intended, but I just made one really similar. So I'm just going to shift click, let's delete the Mars wrap for now. I'm just going to shift click, actually let's get the background solid to be 3D too. I'm going to select all my layers and click in that 3D cube column. And then I'm going to switch to a 2 view and make this left one top down. Alright, so right now everything, if I click P for position, everything's at 0 for Z. It's all on the same level, so it's going to be perceived at whatever scale it was brought in at. I want to click on my black solid. Let me zoom out in this view a little bit. And this isn't going to look any different because it's just black, but I want to push this behind everything else. Looks like the scale's changing. I can just click S to scale that up. And so when we move through it with the null later, we can get that to move also if we want. And then planet-wise, I just want to kind of choose what's in front here. Let's bring the Earth forward. Let's send the Death Star back a little bit. And then let's send Saturn quite a bit further back. And we probably do want to change the scale a little bit as well, just because the Earth is quite a bit larger, even though it's closer. And so now we have these objects that are further apart, but without having a camera moving through it to create parallax, or without having light, we really can't perceive that. Though we can see from the top down that they all are separated. If I went to my solid settings and just made this white instead for now. If I added a light right now, since I have all these different 3D layers, you can see it affects them all, but not really the way I might want. And I can move the light through and illuminate things differently. So it just gives them some colorization. If I want them to all cast a shadow, I can click on all those and just twirl them down all at once. Go to my material options, but holy drop down Batman. And since they're all selected, I just have to click on once, which is definitely helpful. Now I'm not going to use shadows in this composition because it's in outer space, but just to show you the distance in the object to the background is changing the shadow size. So you can see Saturn has the tightest one, whereas Earth is further away. So as we move the light or the background, you're going to see that change. So the proximity has everything to do with the shadow intensity and darkness, both of which we can change under our light settings, if we so wanted to. Now we're going to spend more time with lighting in the next class. For today, I just want to talk a little bit about parenting and moving these objects through 3D space. I'm going to turn cast shadows back off for now after selecting everything. And it went to only for a moment, which is why everything disappeared, which is, kind of terrifying. So I'm just going to click that again to off. And we're back to our seemingly flat objects now. To move through these objects, I can add a camera. And let me just demo that real quick, though that's going to be the focus of a lot of classes coming up. We'll come back to these settings in a moment, this very antiquated camera icon. But we can choose whether there's depth of field, or things further away are in focus or blurred or not. We have a lot of really exact things we can change here. But a camera is like a light in that it's automatically a 3D object. If I collapse everything else here, camera settings are also very light-like, and that they have kind of what the focus is, kind of a cone. But if I move the camera here, you're not actually seeing anything because of the depth. So if we change that, you can see the depth actually changing from this top-down view. And we can change the depth of field, which was definitely altering things. And then if we move along the Z, you could see we can pass these objects, and they're definitely not all at the same depth. We kind of pass them individually, and in that original example I have them spaced out way more than I do in this one, which definitely adds quite a bit to that depth. So these are spaced out quite a bit. So in space 2 here, I'm going to actually just remove that background for now. And let's just space these objects out. The further they are from each other, the more sense of the parallax we're going to get. I might want to zoom in a little bit here because I'm having a hard time seeing which handle is selected. So you've got X, Y, and Z, though of course you could just go to your transform options and scrub the position of the Z there. But if we do a really basic just zoom in here, I'm going to just click my stopwatch for position, but I'm just going to animate the position moving through these planets. So I'm just going to scrub that number through. I scrubbed it so far that I flipped it. And so now, if we play that back, you can see it kind of moving through these shapes and things passing the camera, and we could add a blur to that. We could have it keep moving, which is what I'd like to do. And if we just RAM preview that little bit there, you can get a better sense of the depth we've created. The nice thing about animating the camera or the null is that you only have to animate that one thing. If we were animating these planets individually coming forward, if we decided to change the placement of something or the speed, we'd have to change it for all three. Even though we don't want a drop shadow, we still want a light that sufficiently illuminates everything. So I'm going to pull this back a little bit and go to my light options. And let's increase the intensity a little and make it not caramel colored. And then you can see that that just adds some consistent lighting across the board. We can add a slight color to it, but we can just change that a little bit, and then we could add a background, etc. But we'll continue to add to this in the next class. I just wanted to give you a little overview of 2.5 3D, Faux 3D in After Effects, and just review some of the different things you've probably gone over before, like XYZ dimensions, cameras, light. Last thing I want to replicate here is if I turn the camera off entirely, if we wanted to still simulate that, the cameras take a lot of render time, we can simulate that just like I did in that initial example of using a null object. And null objects are also a layer type. They don't render, they're just there for parenting really. Because this null is going to be controlling 3D objects, I want it to be a 3D object itself, even though, again, it doesn't render at all. That's really just because I need Z in order to control these other objects that have a Z dimension. If I zoom in, you can see from the top-down view, the null is just like a little square. If I click the cube icon, we're looking at it top-down as well. So you can see it's 3D now, but we also have our different options. And I want to parent everything, well, not everything. I'm going to parent my 3 layers to the null. So the parent column is the last one here within the layer palette. If you don't see these options, make sure to click on toggle switches and modes. You could switch between these toggles and then things like the blending modes. You always see the parent column, but if you're not seeing these toggles I mentioned earlier, that's more than likely why. So I'm going to choose null. I created one already, so let's just call this null planet. And let's make that the parent for these 3 layers, so I can do that from the drop down here. Anything could be a parent, it doesn't have to be a null object. But if I am using something that doesn't render, that's what it would be. I can also use this pick whip, which is one of my favorite ridiculous things, aside from shying a layer. You've got this little thing that if you pull it out, it kind of has this kind of spaghetti noodle getting sucked in look, which is totally unnecessary but fun. But I can use that to kind of select the null planet as well. Now whatever I do to this, all the planets are controlled by it also. So you could do this in combination of a camera and lights also. Any combination of these things works great. If I want to move everything over a little, you can see the parallax there too. Just things seem to be moving at a different speed because they're at different distances from each other. So I can kind of control my composition, like not just the stage, but how these objects look together by adjusting the null itself. Or even doing things like rotating it. If I rotate it or change the Y or X axes, it definitely changes all of the attached layers quite a bit. So I'm just going to animate the position moving through. I'm going to click P for position. I'm going to click my stopwatch, and I want to kind of start it about here and move back a little bit. And then we're just going to zoom right past everything. Let's go this way. We're going to zoom in rather than out. So I'm just scrubbing this. I could also click on the Z handle and pull that forward. And so now, I wanted to move the other way, but the beauty of keyframes is that I can just flip-flop where those are. If you've ever done frame-by-frame stuff, like in Flash, tweens and After Effects are one of the greatest things ever. So just by animating this null, it's kind of fun as we go through the Earth. That's why it turns black for a moment there. So if we didn't want that to happen, we could really easily adjust where that is. And if these were all animated individually, if I made one change here, I'd have to go in and change everything else. So I can't overemphasize how helpful nulls are in this situation, especially when you're animating lots of different parts. So there we just kind of have our zoom out. So I would play with that today. You could use whatever layers you want. I've got the space layers in there, but the actual exercise for this is going to be what we cover next week, which I'll be putting up as well. That is this delightful little dance stage here. So this isn't RAM previewed. Let me just let it go through. But I have all these assets that I'll be uploading of the stage. So we'll be talking about making 3D objects that kind of fit together. So some of these are rotated along the X, Y, or Z. You can see there's a lot of lights working together that are spilling on these objects. And then there's some, I'm impatient, I'm just going to scrub through. You can see there's these lovely dancers that come in, but definitely quite a bit more practice with shadows specifically, since that's such a big part of perceiving depth. And that's where the Napoleon GIF comes in, is him bust and move on the stage. You know, I figured to balance things out from very serious space exploration, we should have maybe a dance performance of sorts. So we'll be doing that next week, plus adding some more to our space background, like some of the elements I have here. But I hope you enjoy playing with these techniques. And please let me know if you have any questions.